Authentication and IBM Connections. How to set up Darwino to use IBM Connections as either an LDAP or OAuth-based authentication source. By default, Darwino will use simple form-based authentication for development purposes. However, Darwino is able to use any LDAP provider or OAuth security authority, including IBM Connections. In this video, we will demonstrate how to use IBM Connections as an LDAP authentication source for a Darwino application, and how to configure IBM Connections to be an OAuth single sign-on source for Darwino application authentication, even when the Darwino application is not hosted on the same server as IBM Connections. Before we illustrate the use of IBM Connections as an authentication source, let's focus on how Darwino handles authentication by default. By default, Darwino uses simple form-based authentication using a static XML directory. This is a very useful configuration for development, but clearly not for a deployed application. Darwino manages authentication setup as a bean configuration in the Darwino beans.xml file that is located in the webinf directory. Here, you can configure the use of any standard form of authentication that you wish. As you see, we have configured a test user with a simple password that we use for development purposes. When we launch the application, the simple form-based authentication is displayed, and we can log in using the simple password. We see from the About link that the user is the simple XML almas user. Now, in order to illustrate IBM Connections as an authentication source, we will first show how to use it with simple form-based authentication and then as an OAuth directory source. Let's look at the Darwino beans.xml a little bit more closely. As you can see, we have multiple beans configured to provide authentication sources. Our simple XML directory bean is at the bottom, and the bean that points to IBM Connections is above. We will look at that in more detail in a little while. For now, all we have to do to change our authentication from our test.xml directory to IBM Connections is to uncomment out the bean configuration that points at IBM Connections. Now you see that when we launch the application, the simple form still loads, but the user we previously logged in with no longer works. Instead, we need to use credentials from IBM Connections. As you can see, the application is now using IBM Connections as a simple LDAP source for authentication. When we click the About link now, we see that the user ID number from Connections is displayed instead of the almas user. However, this simple form-based configuration might not be as secure as we would like. So we demonstrate how to configure Darwino to use IBM Connections as an OAuth source now. Before setting up a Darwino app to use OAuth with IBM Connections, you need to configure IBM Connections to recognize the application using a shared key and shared secret. To do this, you need to log into IBM Connections as an administrator and go to the Internal Apps area of IBM Connections. We have already configured this app as the demo app that is listed here at the bottom of the list of internal applications. When we right-click and choose Show Credentials, we see the client key and shared secrets are both available. These values are necessary to be added to the WebXML configuration in the Darwino application. Finally, we make a small change to the WebXML file in the webinf directory. Here we reconfigure Darwino's basic authentication mode from basic form to using the IBM Connections OAuth handler class. Now, after we clear our cookies and reload the Darwino application, the basic Darwino application form is no longer launched, but instead authentication authority is passed to IBM Connections and its default login page. Once we log in, we see the IBM Connections external app confirmation page. We see this the first time we log in, but we won't see it again. Now, when we get to the Darwino application, we are already authenticated, and the user ID from Connections is shown in the About area. We have shown that Darwino application authentication is very flexible, allowing for the use of a static directory for development and any standard LDAP or OAuth source for production. For more information, please check out our website at www.darwino.com.